What I'd like to do over the next 20 minutes or so is to highlight some of Pofma's noteworthy features and place it in a wider political context. I'll argue that Pofma answers the right question, but in the wrong way. And I'll end with a few observations on what this new law tells us about the PAP's transition to its fourth generation leadership. As you know, Pofma empowers ministers to trigger takedown or correction orders against online material that contains false statements of fact, as well as to launch criminal prosecutions in more serious cases. The government positioned Pofma as a response to the global anxiety concerning various kinds of information disorder, including hate speech and industrial strength disinformation campaigns. So in this sense, the government was answering the right question. The problem of disinformation is a real one. Law Minister K. Shanmugam had a point when he said in Parliament that an active democracy requires not only free speech, but also trust and the infrastructure of fact. So in Europe, America, and India, disinformation merchants spread untruths about minorities, refugees, and immigrants, saying that they are raping women, committing crimes, stealing jobs. This sort of disinformation cultivates fear and cynicism, and thus grow the appeal of demagogues and far-right parties. So Western democracies used to believe that press freedom on its own would produce a healthy circulation of information and ideas. That they believe that the answer to bad speech is more speech. But in recent years, they have come to accept that high quality, independent news media are actually no match for well financed, high tech disinformation campaigns. Liberal democracies have become much more open to the idea of regulating internet platforms like Facebook. So the Singapore government is not wrong when it points out that even Western democracies have enacted or are considering new laws to fight the harms of extreme or manipulative online speech. But it's not true that Singapore's Pofma belongs in the same family as European attempts to tackle disinformation, for example. Singapore's answer is not only very different, but also wrong. The right answer, in my view, would not throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. Just because we urgently need to deal with online threats that have emerged in the past few years does not mean we can afford to forget what centuries of history has taught us, which is that the biggest avoidable harms suffered by human society, from famines to genocides, kleptocratic corruption, unnecessary wars, and failed states, happen when power is concentrated and unaccountable. So absolutely, democracies must erect new protections against harmful online speech, but they should not be doing this by dismantling the walls and watchtowers meant to guard against rulers who abuse their power. This is why new laws that are being rolled out in liberal democracies generally include built-in checks against government abuse, such as very precise and narrow legal language, and they operate within a system of vigorous checks and balances, including a free press and interventionist judiciaries who are willing to push back against overreach by the executive branch. In contrast, Pofma tilts the marketplace of ideas decisively in favor of ruling party politicians with few countervailing forces. So I'll highlight just two of the most problematic features. First, Pofma conflates governmental interests with the wider public interest. The Act's powers can be triggered only if the falsehoods harm the public interest, which is good. But the law makes it difficult for anyone to challenge the government's reading of what is or isn't in the public interest. In most democracies, the courts regularly act as a neutral referee to decide whether a government restriction on speech really is required for the public interest. But with Pofma, though, the Singapore government does not want judges to make that assessment. The, the law specifies three and only three tests that the High Court can apply when hearing an appeal against a correction or takedown order. And if you look at this list of three tests, you will notice that the public interest test is not one of them. The court is not asked to test the government's use of Pofma against the court's own assessment of what is or isn't in the public interest. So this is especially problematic because Pofma defines the public interest in a radically novel manner, even by Singapore standards. Pofma says that that a minister can be considered to be serving the public interest if he does anything, I quote, to prevent a diminution of public confidence in the work of any part of any public sector entity. Now, this is not the only law that tries to protect the standing of the government from verbal attack. The Sedition Act, inherited from the colonial era, makes it a crime to publish something that would tend to bring into hatred or contempt or to excite disaffection against the government. But the Sedition Act makes a crucial exception. It's not sedition if what you publish is likely to show that the government has been misled or mistaken in any of its measures. So this you'll read in section 3, bracket 2. Shall not be deemed to be seditious if the speech shows that the government has been misled or mistaken in any of its measures. So to put it simply, if the government is wrong and needs to be taken down a notch, it's not seditious to say so. After all, in a democracy, it's our patriotic duty as citizens to sound the alarm when we see something go awry. See something, say something. And even the Sedition Act, a draconian piece of legislation from the era when Singaporeans were colonial subjects and not self-governing citizens, recognizes that. So fast forward to Pofma. Where is the so-called good citizen exception in the letter of the law? There's none, right? So whereas the Sedition Act makes this exception, Pofma doesn't. Pofma does not protect against an unjustified diminution of public confidence. The word unjustified isn't in the law. It aims to shield each government department from a loss of public confidence, period, regardless of whether its current high levels of public confidence are deserved or the result of the public being kept in the dark. So as long as the minister can point to any false statement of fact in what's published, even if that falsehood is not central to the thrust of an article, he can order a takedown. The government even rejected calls for an independent or arm's length regulator to serve as a buffer or clearinghouse in order to protect the system from the whims of ministers. Instead, the new body that issues correction and takedown orders must comply with ministers' directions. So that's the first point, this conflation of government interest and public interest, which in a democracy is essential to keep separate. The second striking feature of Pofma that I want to talk about is that its weapons can be triggered only by government ministers. Members of the public and opposition politicians cannot use the law to initiate corrections and take down orders. In contrast, a new law that's been introduced in France would allow candidates of any party to get a magistrate's order against falsehoods leveled against them during election campaigns. It aims to protect the integrity of elections for all contenders, not just for the ruling party. Even Singapore's much feared Defamation Act is a fairer piece of legislation than Pofma. After all, whoever you are, if your reputation has been harmed by a falsehood, you can sue for defamation because we all have a right to reputation. But let's say you are a victim of an online falsehood of exactly the kind that the government warned about during the Pofma debate. Perhaps in the course of a public debate on an important national issue, you have something valuable to contribute because of your professional expertise or your unique insights into a particular community that's affected, or because you are a representative of a stakeholder group. Let's say your viewpoints are misrepresented by people who oppose you. They twist your words, they claim you say things you actually did not say. They then use online tools to make their disinformation, their lies about what you said, go viral. You try to thrash it out in the marketplace of ideas, but find that you are fighting a losing battle because their falsehoods are pumped up with social media steroids. We would thus end up with false statements or facts about what you said, polluting our national discourse in a way that's detrimental to the public interest. Now, all this sounds exactly like the scenario that Pofma is designed to deal with, except in one respect. If you are not a government minister, forget about it. You don't get to use Pofma. The government has gone to great lengths to persuade us that since their decisions can be appealed, Pofma does not make ministers the final arbiters of truth. Perhaps. But Pofma does give ministers the final say, indeed the only say, about which truths should be protected by Pofma and which inconvenient truths should be left to the law of the jungle. The government has also invoked the principle of the right of reply when demanding corrections. But a right that belongs only to the most powerful men and women in the country makes a mockery of the term. That does not sound like a right. I'm not for a moment suggesting that Pofma's powers should be democratized such that all of us get to issue takedown or correction orders just like ministers. What I am saying is that if the government thinks it would be dangerous to distribute Pofma powers to everyone, well, that's a pretty good indication that ministers should not have such powers either. And that is exactly why other democracies, even as they try to fight, say, violent extremism and hate speech online, are not legislating against false statements of fact the way Singapore is. Other democracies have correctly concluded that it is simply too difficult to do so in a way that does not open the door to massive government abuse. So, for example, Germany's Net Enforcement Act, which is probably the strongest of all the online harm laws that have been introduced in democracies in recent years. This law in Germany is not actually a fake news law, even though it has been talked about that way routinely by the Singapore government. The German law imposes additional obligations and higher penalties to ensure that large internet platform companies comply with existing German laws such as hate speech. The German law does not create any new offense of online falsehood or fake news or anything like that. I'm also not saying that there is no room for stronger laws against online disinformation. I have written before that in some ways, Pofma does not go far enough. It is not tough enough. We know that some PR consultants around the world have been as corrupt as Facebook in facilitating disinformation. Governments should be far stricter with the public relations and advertising industries. We have also learned a lot in recent years about inauthentic accounts, secretly funded influence campaigns, micro-targeting of audiences, and so on that are used to manipulate public opinion. I would favor much stronger legislation to ensure transparency about who is paying whom to say and spread disinformation and ideas. As long as, of course, such legislation regulates the government's own cyber campaigns and computational propaganda work, and not only non-government use of such tools. I will leave it to my fellow panelists to continue to peel the Pofma onion so that we can all have a good cry. But at this point, I would like to shift gears and ask what Pofma says about the PAP regime. Pofma and the way it was legislated opens a window into the mind of the government at this very interesting period of leadership transition. First, Pofma unveils the true heir to the Lee Kuan Yew mantle. I'm not talking about Lee's bloodline nor his official title. I'm referring to Lee Kuan Yew's role as a politico-legal entrepreneur who was an expert in bulldozing a clear path for PAP dominance through his sometimes audacious legal and constitutional innovations, whether it was the Newspaper and Printing Presses Act of 1974, or the GRC system, or the ministerial pay formula. As LKY faded from the scene, it looked like there was nobody in the PAP with the legal mind, the shrewd instincts, or the street fighter temperament to carry out such ballsy interventions. Until now. K. Shanmugam may not carry the Lee name and may be, according to the PAP, too Indian to be Prime Minister, but he can be considered the spiritual inheritor of this key part of LKY's political legacy. Shanmugam's Pofma is quite simply the most sweeping media legislation since the LKY era's 1988 amendments to the NPPA. That's the one that allowed the government to gazette foreign publications that did not give the government the unedited right of reply. This instrument, you may remember, was used frequently in the 1980s and 90s against Time, The Economist, and so on. For many years, as a so-called media expert, I had been trying to predict how the government would update its 1988 right of reply law for the digital age. I came to the conclusion that it was impossible, but Shanmugam found a way. Second, Pofma reveals both extreme confidence and a certain insecurity within the government. Why do I say it shows confidence? Well, the government has acknowledged that Pofma can be abused by any ruling party because it is written in such a broad and sweeping way. But the government says there's no need to worry as long as Pofma remains in the right hands. Now, in democracies that have a regular turnover of government, ruling parties are always extremely careful about the laws they introduce because they know that they could be a ruling party today, but in the opposition next year, and they could end up being targeted by the same laws that it introduced last year. So if the PAP is not at all worried about Pofma, it's obviously because they don't foresee that Pofma will ever end up in the wrong hands, that is, in your hands as the opposition. It is also clearly very confident that the critics of Pofma, like me, are in a very small minority, and that in the end, this law will not be a vote loser, that the law may actually be popular among most people. At the same time, the introduction of Pofma suggests some uncertainty within the government about the next election and the transition to 4G. In the transition from 1G to 2G, Goh Chok Tong and his colleagues were self-confident enough to declare that they would open up a little more space for alternative views. It didn't last long, but still. Strong, confident leaders know that they can survive and even thrive in an environment of robust and wide-open debate. They trust their own ability to present good ideas and to beat bad ones, and they trust the public to know the difference. Conversely, when we see a government increasingly reaching for the law to settle debates, it can only mean a lack of trust in either itself or the public, or both. Pofma, I think, indicates that the Heng Swee Keat government will remain wedded to the PAP's current model of executive dominance, that is, giving cabinet ministers maximum room for maneuver in the name of governmental efficiency, with lower levels of public accountability than what international best practice would consider wise or prudent. Yes, online disinformation and manipulation can be a harmful weapon, but Pofma isn't really about demilitarizing cyberspace. It is about giving the ruling party a monopoly over these tools. Thank you.